I found tampons in my husband's car, and I wished that he had been unfaithful to me instead. That way, my kids wouldn't have to go through this. I am a 29-year-old woman who has been married to my 30-year-old husband for 7 years. For 4 years, I've never had any reason to suspect that he was unfaithful to me or even remotely unhappy with our marriage. He likes to joke that we're still in the honeymoon phase. Even after almost 5 years and having 2 kids, I wouldn't have questioned that, or him, were it not for a surprise I found in his car last month. I was putting our child into her car seat last month when I noticed something tucked between the cushions. At first, I thought it was just some stray toy or snack wrapper, so I reached down to fish it out. When my hand closed around the object, I felt the familiar cylindrical shape of a tampon. Confusion washed over me as I pulled it into view. The bright wrapper stood out against the upholstery. This wouldn't have been so unusual if I hadn't had an IUD that had stopped my periods for the past year. Moreover, I didn't even recognize the wrapper style. It was a brand I had never used, a small but glaring discrepancy that made my stomach churn. Later that evening, I brought it to my husband's attention, still holding the offending item as if it were evidence in a mystery that I was desperate to solve. First, he stared at the tampon in my hand with genuine confusion. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, furrowing his brow. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice calm. "I found it in your car between the pillows, and it's not mine. I haven't had a period in over a year." His face remained blank for a moment more before realization dawned on him. He shrugged and said it probably belonged to his co-worker, Fiona. His initial confusion quickly gave way to dismissiveness as he dismissed my concerns with a nonchalant explanation. "Probably Fiona," he said with a shrug. Turning back to his phone, he added, "She must have dropped it when we went out to lunch the other day." I stared at him, waiting for a sign that he understood why this was bothering me, but there was nothing. No apology, no concern, just a casual dismissal. It was like the tampon was no big deal and I was overreacting. It felt like a slap in the face that left me reeling and questioning everything I thought I knew about our marriage. It's not uncommon for my husband to carpool to lunch with his co-workers. We were both quite close to Fiona and her husband. The thought of my husband carpooling with Fiona and her husband had always been a non-issue. They were friends, and it wasn't unusual for them to share rides to lunch. We often socialized as couples, spending weekends at each other's houses for barbecues or movie nights. Fiona and I had even bonded over common experiences, like the challenges of juggling work and family life while our children played together. We talked about everything from the latest office gossip to more personal matters. Considering how often they carpooled, I assured myself that the tampon could have easily slipped out of Fiona's purse during one of those trips. Maybe it fell out when she reached for her phone or wallet and got knocked around. No big deal, right? I shrugged it off as a harmless mistake and told myself there was no need to worry. After all, our friendship with Fiona and her husband was solid, built on years of trust and shared experiences. There was no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary, so I put the disconcerting discovery to the back of my mind, determined not to let a small, easily explained incident cause unnecessary drama. I put it out of my mind until we had dinner with Fiona and her husband a few weeks later. I wanted to believe my husband, but I just couldn't get over the way he'd reacted. So, I did something that I feel kind of crazy about now. I faked an emergency and asked Fiona if she had any tampons while we were out together. She handed me one that was almost identical to the tampon I'd found in our back seat. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking there was an innocent explanation as to why it had been left in the back seat in the first place. I thought I'd seen the last of the misplaced feminine hygiene products until I found another tampon this morning, this time in my sock drawer. I feel physically ill at the thought that my husband is having an affair, and even more sickened by the thought that someone could have left those tampons out for me to find. If she was my husband's coworker, why would she give herself away by offering me one the other night? In any other situation, I would want to talk to my husband about this, but I feel too sick and embarrassed to approach him. Dwelling on what I found, looking at every possible source of these 2 tampons has been my personal hell for the past few weeks. But I wanted to share an update. After posting here, I told my sister what happened regarding the tampon in the back seat, my husband's cluelessness, Fiona's tampon, and all the things I suspected but didn't want to believe. We were comparing tampons, except for the one in the back seat which I had already discarded. They were a match only in absorbency. I made sure not to leave them in a place where my husband or my daughters would find them, and my daughters didn't know what they were or where they had come from. My sister was convinced that Fiona was either involved with my husband, me, or both. Direct confrontation with either party still seemed like a bad idea, so she suggested that we invite Fiona and her husband to our Labor Day barbecue. Unfortunately, they already had plans. My sister and I agreed that it was too early to install cameras without other evidence. So, from there, it was just a waiting game. I watched my husband for any change in behavior, but there was none. We searched our house for any misplaced foreign objects, and there were none. I even kept an eye on the girls in case they might have met someone new, perhaps my sister's boyfriend. My husband was adamant that this wasn't the case. He said that if anything had happened in or around our house, it would be impossible to keep it from me and the girls since he was the one taking them to and from daycare and most other activities during the week. I took some comfort in this, until my younger daughter, who's 2 years old, came down with something last week. I wanted to be the one at home taking care of her, but my husband insisted that I stay at work. While he was home with her, I was fine with it. My sister and her husband agreed, thinking it was a good sign that he would take time off at a moment's notice. By the 3rd or 4th day, I was just happy to have a nearly healthy child and a husband who was seeing her through it. But when I came home, I found something strange. The toddler I'd left that morning in an old PJ set was now dressed in a onesie I'd never seen before, with a design I can't quite describe. I can't say that I have the sharpest memory, but I do have a pretty good sense of what my kids wear on a daily basis, especially what I'd sworn off. I had stopped using full-length sleep suits with snaps down the front long before we had our second child. The long snaps are just a pain in the neck and a no for efficient diaper changes, in my opinion. It's just not something I would dress her in, and my husband knows that as well. He doesn't usually plan or buy clothes for the girls, and he certainly doesn't accessorize them. So, I was confused and kind of devastated at the thought that someone could be around our sick child without my knowledge. But I didn't think twice and went straight to my husband to ask if anyone had been over to see him or the girls. He seemed as confused as before and asked me why I would think that. He said it was just him and the kids all day. I asked him again if anyone had even stopped by to say hello. He denied it and told me to calm down, saying that I might get angry with unfounded accusations. But our older daughter was in the room and she sensed something. I asked him a 3rd time if anyone had been around our house with the children. My husband swore that it had been no one but him. He also denied buying new clothes or doing anyone's hair while our daughter was in the room. My emotions were all over the place, and I decided to leave. I couldn't make sense of it at the time, and it hardly seems clearer now. After driving myself half-crazy with explanations that don't add up, after nearly losing my mind over a hair clip and a onesie, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere with my accusations and half-baked theories. I'd been so wrapped up in paranoia and misery that I wasn't sleeping, eating, or taking care of my children the way I should have, and I wasn't getting any answers. So, I decided to go ahead and order hidden cameras and have them sent to my sister's house. My brother-in-law agreed to help set them up at my house. Before the cameras were ever delivered, though I did get my long-awaited confirmation last week, the day began like any other weekday morning in our busy household. My husband and I rushed around trying to get our 2 energetic daughters into their school uniforms, all the while trying to grab a quick bite to eat ourselves. Amid the chaos, there was a sense of camaraderie in the air, as if we were all in this hectic dance together. After the girls were dropped off at school, my husband and I went to our respective workplaces. I was counting down the hours until we could be reunited with our little ones, but there was a strange feeling that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. It only intensified when I received a notification on my phone while I was at work, ring notification, movement at the front door. I half-clicked on the video clip, expecting to see the usual delivery person or neighbor walking by. But what I saw stunned me. Standing there on my doorstep was a young woman leading my daughter into the house, hand in hand with my husband, and my other daughter close behind. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The girls were supposed to be in daycare and my husband was at work. As far as I knew, this woman, my sister, in-law, lived 2 states away with a court order keeping her there. Yet here she was, in our home with my husband and my children. A wave of panic washed over me as I tried to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of mistake, a misunderstanding, or was there something more sinister at play? I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach as I realized that the answers to my questions could be far more disturbing than I could have ever imagined. I stared at the screen in disbelief, the blood pounding in my ears as I watched the unthinkable unfold before my eyes. On the footage captured by our Ring doorbell was a scene out of a nightmare, a woman I hadn't seen in years leading my youngest daughter into our home, hand in hand with my husband and my older daughter following behind. The shock of the moment was overwhelming. How could this happen? The girls were supposed to be in daycare and my husband at work, yet there they were, entering our home with a woman I never thought I'd see again. My first reaction was one of utter disbelief, a desperate hope that there must be some mistake, some innocent explanation for what I was witnessing. But as the reality of the situation sunk in, a wave of anger surged through me like a tidal wave, threatening to consume everything in its path. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers, my heart pounding in my chest as I dialed my husband's number. I needed answers and I needed them now. But when the phone rang on the other end, there was no answer. I immediately called my husband to ask him what on earth this woman was doing in our house. He didn't answer, so I texted him. Even in his apparent obtuseness, he probably realized he'd made a huge blunder by bringing her through the front door, knowing I'd received the Ring notification. He likely wanted to delay the inevitable, as I made the 5th or 6th subsequent call. Eventually, he did pick up. The woman on the camera, I would later find out, was my husband's sister. She was the likely source of both the tampons, the onesie, and the bow. She also had a history of abuse and was a recovering addict who'd spent a significant part of her adolescence and young adulthood in that state. She was one of my husband's family members who'd been silent for years after being abused, and I hadn't seen or heard from her in ages. From the way my husband talked about her, I never thought I'd see her again. But there she was, in our house with our children. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her after years of silence that left me reeling. It was the realization of what her presence meant for our home, for my family. Fresh from another stint in rehab, she was the last person I expected to sneak into our lives under such clandestine circumstances. This realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about a random tampon or a harmless mistake, it was about deception and betrayal at the deepest level. Suffice it to say, I was furious. It wasn't an affair, yet it somehow felt infinitely more revolting. I needed to know who she was and why this was happening. Apparently, my sister-in-law had wanted to make amends with the people she'd hurt, and my husband was at the top of that list. The irony of her attempting reconciliation through deceit and intrusion wasn't lost on me. It was also clear that my husband didn't want me to know, or worse, was trying to keep her, a family member, away from our children. So, they would meet in secret, often at our house. When I was at work, they'd enter through the garage in my husband's car, so the Ring camera on the front door wouldn't alert me. The level of planning and secrecy involved made my skin crawl. She even spent the night on a weekend when I was away on business and slept in our bed. The mere thought of her in our house, in our bed, made me feel violated. One night, she was babysitting our girls while my husband told me he was with his parents. The ease with which he'd lied to me and kept this secret made me question everything I thought I knew about him. She bought clothes for the girls and dressed my youngest in the onesie and bow that my husband had seen. Seeing my daughter in this unfamiliar outfit, with a tiny barrette in her hair, now felt like a haunting reminder of the betrayal that had occurred right under my nose. Yet, when I turned to my husband for reassurance, for a glimmer of hope amidst the uncertainty, all I found was disbelief and denial. He dismissed my concerns with a casual shrug, insisting it was all in my head, that I was overreacting to a series of harmless coincidences. My husband swore that the tampons, the onesie, the bow, and all the rest were just figments of my imagination. He seemed content to watch me torture myself for weeks over a woman he insisted didn't exist, shrugging off each increasingly disturbing discovery as if it were news to him and telling me I was being irrational. He even insinuated that I had postpartum depression, 2 years after I'd given birth 4 years earlier. I'd later told him that one of my greatest fears about motherhood was developing PPD, like my mother had, and not being fully present for our babies, being left with a world of guilt and regret as they grew older. But as the weeks turned into months and the truth remained stubbornly out of reach, my patience wore thin, replaced by a simmering rage that threatened to consume me entirely. How could he dismiss my fears so callously? How could he gaslight me into doubting my own sanity? How could he stand by while our family teetered on the brink of collapse? He told me I wasn't sleeping enough, that I missed the girls too much, and that I needed to take a step back and reevaluate my mental health. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because he was my husband, and no other version of events made sense. But after a month, I had nothing to show for my trust, except this pathetic situation and a lot of anger that my husband didn't seem to care. When confronted, he stammered and stumbled over his words, offering half-hearted excuses. He mumbled something about trying to protect me from unnecessary stress, that his sister just wanted to make amends. But his words were disjointed and unconvincing. Each excuse was less believable than the last, a desperate attempt to hide the truth. His evasiveness only confirmed my worst fears. The man I had trusted and built a life with was now a stranger to me, hiding behind a facade of lies and deceit. I watched as he avoided eye contact, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The weight of his betrayal hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence that neither of us could ignore. There was no rational explanation for his actions or for the deception that was corroding our marriage every time he opened his mouth. I could see the panic in his eyes, the realization that he'd been caught and there was no way out. His silence spoke louder than any words could, revealing the depth of his betrayal. I knew then that I couldn't stay with someone who had so blatantly betrayed my trust and jeopardized the safety of our children. The thought of exposing my daughters to such toxic secrecy and manipulation was unbearable. I had to prioritize their well-being, and that meant making the hardest decision of my life. With a heavy heart, I told him I wanted a divorce. The look of shock and despair on his face was almost pitiful, but it couldn't undo the damage he'd caused. I walked away, determined to protect my children from further harm. I decided to end the relationship and file for divorce. The decision was both heartbreaking and liberating. It was devastating to realize that our 7-year journey had come to such a bitter end. But it was also liberating to take control of my life and prioritize the well-being of my children and myself. The divorce process was long and grueling. Each step felt like another battle in an endless war. There were countless court hearings, each more draining than the last, where I had to relive the pain and betrayal over and over again. My husband fought me every step of the way, refusing to take responsibility for his actions and attempting to portray himself as the victim. His determination to contest every detail made the process more exhausting and emotionally draining. I described in detail the discovery of the tampons, the hidden meetings with my sister-in-law, and the lies my husband had told to cover his tracks. I presented the ring footage that captured them entering our home with my children and provided testimony from my sister and brother-in-law to support my claims. However, the court needed more than assumptions about my sister-in-law's character. They required concrete evidence of her past and present behavior, which wasn't easy to obtain. Despite these challenges, I remained focused on the bigger picture. I emphasized my husband's betrayal, which was undeniable. The court recognized the complexity of the situation and the emotional turmoil I'd endured. After months of legal wrangling and countless court appearances, the judge ruled in my favor. I was granted primary custody of our daughters, with my husband receiving supervised visitation rights. The judge recognized the need for a stable environment for the children, given the deception and potential risks involved. This ordeal taught me several valuable lessons that I hope others can learn from. First, trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild. Second, listen to your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Communication is key. Address issues head-on rather than ignoring them. Most importantly, never settle for less than you deserve. My children and I deserve a life free from deception and betrayal, and I am committed to building that future for us. What do you think of this story? Please leave a comment below to let me know.